The earth holds its dead the way certain houses hold their secrets compressed under years of wait and silence until something finally gives. In the Harwick house, it was not fire or screaming that broke the quiet. It was a thin line of light along the grain of the dining room floorboards, barely visible, the kind of thing that looks like a scar that never properly closed. What lay beneath that floor, under a room where a family had said their prayers and eaten their meals and lived an unremarkable life for 3 decades, was not what anyone expected. What was down there changed the meaning of everything that had happened in that house. Every meal. Every ordinary Tuesday. This is not a folktale. It is a documented account assembled from coroner's records, county court documents, a woman's personal diary, and the testimony of a man who devoted his final years to making sure none of it was forgotten. The events took place in Harlan County, Kentucky in 1887, and every detail of them mattered. Harlan County sits in the southeastern corner of the state, pressed against the Virginia border by the ridges of the Cumberland Mountains, which rise so steeply and so close together that the valleys between them receive only a few hours of direct sunlight even at the height of summer. It is a landscape that does not shelter people so much as observe them, heavy in clothes and watchful. In 1887, the town of Loyal, which would not be officially incorporated until 1912, was nothing more than a loose arrangement of buildings along Martins Fork Creek, a general store, a Methodist church, a grain mill, a blacksmith, perhaps 40 households within walking distance of one another. The railroad had not arrived. The coal companies had not arrived. Within a decade, both would transform the county entirely, flooding its valleys with machinery and labor and ambition. But in 1887, none of that had happened yet. The county was quiet in the way places become quiet when they have been largely left alone. The Harwick property sat on a low ridge roughly a mile and a half north of the Loyal settlement, reached by a rutted wagon track that followed the creek before climbing a short embankment and opening into a wide, irregular yard. The house was substantial for the region. 2 stories of hewn timber on a stone foundation, a covered front porch, a separate kitchen attached by a covered walkway, a root cellar dug into the hillside, several outbuildings in varying states of repair. The structure had been built in phases, the original single room dating to sometime in the 1830s, the larger addition including the dining room completed in the 1850s, according to a deed recorded in Harlan County in 1856. 3 families had lived on the property before the Harwicks. The first was a man named Dunnar, who built the original structure and farmed the creek bottom. He sold in 1841 to a family named Slaggle, who extended the outbuildings and added the kitchen walkway. The Slaggles held it for 15 years before selling to a man named Cord Harwick in the spring of 1856. Cord Harwick was 41 years old when he purchased the place. He had come from Letcher County, where he had briefly run a small tannery before a dispute with a business partner, the nature of which was never publicly specified, persuaded him that a fresh start in a neighboring county was preferable to remaining in Whitesburg. He arrived in Harlan County with a wagon, a wife named Eleonora, and 3 children between the ages of 6 and 12. His reputation was neither good nor bad. It was simply absent, which in a place where most men carried the weight of known families and established histories gave him a peculiar undefined quality. He was a man from somewhere else. Eleanora Harwick was, by most accounts, a capable woman. Organized, plain-spoken, not given to excessive sociability, but not unfriendly either, she ran the household with a quiet efficiency that tends to be noticed only in its absence. She kept a kitchen garden and preserved her own vegetables. She attended the Methodist church without particular fervor, but with reliable regularity. She had opinions and expressed them without apology. Neighbors sometimes described her as reserved, but this seemed to have been a deliberate posture rather than a natural one. She was always watching. Their children, 2 sons and a daughter, were Walter aged 12, Daniel aged 9, and Nora aged 9, and Nora aged 6 when the family moved to the property. By 1887, 31 years later, Walter was 43, married with his own children, living 2 counties away in Bell County. Daniel had died of fever in 1872 at the age of 24. Nora, now Nora Harwick Pruitt after marrying a man named George Pruitt, was 37 and living 6 miles from the family home. Court Harwick had died in the winter of 1881 at 66 years old, the county physician recording the cause as congestion of the lungs. Eleanora had buried him in the small family plot at the edge of the property, marked his grave with a carved stone, and continued living in the house. She was 72 years old in the spring of 1887. She had lived on that ridge for 31 years and had never once suspected that the floor of her dining room was not what it appeared to be. It began on a morning in March. Eleanora had risen early as she always did, moving through the house with the comfortable ease of someone who knew every board and corner by feel. She made her fire, set the water to heat, and walked through the covered passage to the dining room to retrieve a crock of dried beans she had left on the sideboard the night before. She was crossing the floor when she heard it. Not quite a knock, not quite an echo, but something between the two, a hollow resonance coming from beneath her right foot as she stepped across a particular section near the center of the room. She stopped. She stepped back. She took the step again. The sound returned, unmistakable now, a faint but definite emptiness that bore no resemblance to the solid, close-grained sound produced by the rest of the floor. She stood on that spot for a long moment, pressing her weight down and listening. This was not the sound of a settling foundation. Eleanora had lived in old houses long enough to know what settling sounded like. This was the sound of a void, of something built deliberately to be empty. She got down on her hands and knees. The floorboards in the dining room were wide-cut oak planks, dark with decades of cleaning, fitted together so tightly that sliding a knife blade between them would have been difficult in most sections. But when she bent close to the hollow section, she noticed something she had apparently never seen before, though she would later say she could not understand how she had missed it because once she saw it, it seemed completely obvious. The grain of the boards in that central section did not flow continuously with the grain of the surrounding floor. The wood was the same species, the same width, the same color, stained by years of the same cleaning cloth and kitchen smoke. But the grain ran differently. In the boards on either side, it curved and stretched into long, flowing arcs of timber cut from old-growth trees full of variation and character. In the central section, roughly 4 feet by 3 feet, the grain was straighter, tighter, more uniform, like boards cut from a different tree or chosen for a different purpose and placed here as a careful match. She pressed her fingertips along the edges of the section. The gap was almost invisible, but it was there. A hairline separation running along all 4 sides, a door in the floor. Eleanora Harwick was kneeling on the boards of her dining room in a house she had lived in for 31 years, and she was looking at something she had never known existed. She sat back on her heels for a long time. Then she stood, walked out of the room, walked out of the house, and walked the full 6 miles to her daughter's home without saying a word about what she had found until she arrived. George Pruitt was a practical man. A builder by trade, methodical and competent, not given to dramatic interpretations of ordinary events. He was 39, 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, with the careful hands of someone who worked with timber and understood its nature. He had been married to Nora for 14 years. He respected his mother-in-law and trusted her judgment. When Eleanor appeared at their door and told him she had found something unusual beneath the dining room floor, he did not ask many questions. He put on his coat. They arrived at the Harwick house in the early afternoon, George and Nora together, George carrying his tool bag out of professional habit. In the dining room, Eleanora showed him the section. He knelt, ran his hands across it the same way she had, pressed down, listened to the hollow return. Then he took a thin-bladed tool and worked it carefully along the edge, confirming what she had already found. The separation was clean and precise. Not a gap caused by shrinkage or poor joinery, but a manufactured joint built to close tight. He worked his way around all 4 sides, probing for any locking mechanism, any peg or pin. He found nothing on the north side or the east. On the south, near the center of the edge, his finger found something that gave a small recessed tab built into the underside of the panel, invisible from above without deliberate probing. He pressed it. The panel shifted perhaps a 1/4 of an inch, enough to break the seal. George looked up at Nora and Eleanora. Neither of them spoke. He gripped the edge with both hands and lifted. The panel was hinged on the north side, a pair of heavy iron hinges recessed so deeply into the wood that they had been entirely invisible from above. It swung up and over, settling against the floor with a slow, controlled movement that told George immediately this was the work of a skilled craftsman. The hinges had been designed to bear the weight of the panel without sagging, to swing cleanly without binding, and to stay open without falling back. Beneath the panel was a framed opening, roughly 3 feet by 2.5 feet, mortised into the surrounding floor structure with enough solidity to bear the full weight of furniture placed directly above it without any deflection. And below the opening, dropping away into complete darkness, was a staircase, cut stone steps, narrow and steep, descending at a sharp angle into absolute blackness. The three of them knelt at the edge and looked down. The air that came up from below was cold and still, and it carried with it a faint, complex smell that none of them could immediately name. Old earth, certainly. Stone. And something else, something without a familiar category. Something that settled at the back of the throat and remained there. "How far does it go?" Nora asked. George got a candle from the kitchen. He held it at the opening and watched the flame bend slightly. There was a draft from below, barely perceptible, which meant whatever space lay at the bottom was connected somewhere to outside air. He counted 7 steps in the candle's reach and then darkness. He looked at Eleonora. "Did your husband ever mention anything about this?" Her expression was not what either of them expected. It was not surprise or confusion. It was something harder to name than either of those, something George Pruitt would later describe in his testimony before the Harlan County Court as recognition without understanding. "No," she said quietly. "He never mentioned it." Then, after a moment, she added something that George would repeat many times in the weeks that followed, and that would become one of the most quoted lines in the county records associated with this case. "But I think I know what it is." To understand what Eleonora believed she had found and why she believed it, it is necessary to step back from the house on the ridge and look at the broader landscape in which it existed. Harlan County sits in a peculiar geographic and historical position. Surrounded by mountains that made large-scale plantation agriculture essentially impossible, the county had never developed the kind of slave economy that defined the Bluegrass region and much of the central and western parts of the state. Farms in Harlan County were small and self-sustaining. Slaveholding existed but was limited. The 1850 census recorded fewer than 120 enslaved persons in the entire county, spread across roughly 20 households, most of them holding 2 or 3 individuals rather than the dozens or hundreds that characterized the plantation counties to the north and west. This did not mean the county was without conflict over the question of slavery. The proximity to Virginia, whose border ran barely 15 miles east of Loyal, created a particular set of tensions that were different from those of the plantation regions, but no less significant. The mountains that isolated Harlan County from the broader currents of state and national life also created a corridor. The ridgelines and creek valleys of the Cumberland Mountains had long been traveled by people moving without permission. People who had decided at enormous personal risk that the life they had been assigned was not the life they would accept. The route through Harlan County was not one of the formally documented pathways of the Underground Railroad. Those more organized networks tended to run through the central and western parts of the state, through Louisville and Lexington, and the river crossings to the north. What passed through the southeastern mountains was something more informal, more improvised, more dependent on individual human decisions made in darkness and silent. People in these mountains helped those who were running, not because they belonged to any organization, not because they received instructions or compensation, but because when a desperate person appeared at their door in the night, some people opened the door and some did not. The Harwick house sat on a ridge with long sight lines in 3 directions. It was 1.5 miles from the nearest settlement. It had a root cellar and multiple outbuildings. It sat along a route that someone traveling north through the mountains on foot would find a reasonable place to stop. What Eleonora had suspected for a long time, and what she had never asked Cord directly, and what Cord had never told her, was that the man she had married had at some point before their life together in Harlan County been involved in something he had reason to conceal. Not a criminal matter in the ordinary sense, not the kind that left records, but a buried history. She had pieced it together over 3 decades from things that had no business fitting together as neatly as they did. A conversation she had overheard in the summer of 1858 when an unrecognized man had arrived after dark and left before dawn, and the look on Cord's face as he watched him go. A passage in Cord's personal journal found after his death that referred to arrangements and to the lower passage in terms too opaque to interpret clearly, but too specific to dismiss entirely. The behavior of their dog, a large mixed hound named Barker, who had spent several nights in the late 1850s and early 1860s stationed at the north end of the dining room with an alertness she had attributed at the time to something burrowing under the house. She had suspected something was down there. She had not known its form. Now she did. George descended the stairs first with a lantern, placing his feet carefully on each cut stone step and testing each one before committing his weight. The steps were solid. The stone was dry and stable, the edges still sharp, showing no particular erosion. Whoever had cut and laid them had known exactly what they were doing. There were 11 steps. George counted as he descended. At the bottom, the lantern's light spread across a low-ceiling chamber, cut directly into the earth and stone of the ridge. The walls were shored with timber, old and dark with age, fitted against the stone with wooden wedges driven into the gaps to prevent collapse. The floor was bare earth, packed hard and smooth. The ceiling, supported by the same timber framework, reached roughly 6 feet at its highest point and dropped slightly toward the back of the space. The chamber was approximately 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. It was not empty. Against the far wall, arranged with a care immediately apparent even without understanding the context, were several objects. A wooden sleeping platform raised off the earth on low runners, the kind of simple bed that could be built in an afternoon from rough lumber. An iron hook set into the wall holding 2 folded wool blankets, aged to the color of old tea. Beneath the hook, a tin cup and a tin plate, their surfaces uniformly oxidized. A flat wooden box against the east wall with its lid closed. And in the corner nearest the stairs, pressed into the angle where 2 walls met as if placed there by someone who had thought carefully about where it would do the most good, a small iron stove no more than 2 feet high, with a pipe that rose into the ceiling and disappeared. Not through the floor of the dining room above, as George had half expected, but through the stone of the ridge wall itself, exiting, as he would confirm in a later examination, at a point roughly 15 feet east of the house where the chimney's outlet was hidden behind a dense thicket of rhododendron that had grown against the hillside over many years. George stood in the center of the chamber and turned slowly with the lantern, and he understood what he was looking at. This was a room built for people to live in without anyone above or outside knowing they were there. The stove vented sideways through the mountain rather than upward to prevent smoke from appearing above the house. The staircase was hidden beneath a floor panel designed to be invisible. The chamber was cut deep enough into the ridge that no sound from within would reach the surface. He climbed back up. Nora and Eleanor were sitting at the dining room table. Neither had spoken since he went down. "There is a room," he said. "A proper room with a sleeping platform and a stove. The stove vents through the hill." Nora looked at her mother. Eleanor was looking at the open panel in the floor. "How old is it?" Nora asked. "The timber is very old," George said. "The stove is cast iron. Could be 20, 30 years old. Could be older." He paused. "There are blankets still down there." Eleanor said nothing. George sat down. He placed the lantern on the table and looked at his mother-in-law for a long moment. "Mrs. Harwick," he said, "what do you know about this room?" Eleanor looked up. Her eyes were clear and direct, as they always were. But beneath the clarity there was something else, a tiredness maybe, or the weight of something that had been carried for a very long time and was only now being set down. "I know it was there before we arrived," she said. "The room was there when Cord bought this house. The Slaggles built it, or had it built, sometime in the 1840s. She paused. "I believe it was used for what you think it was used for, and I believe it was used after we arrived as well, though Cord never told me so directly." Nora stared at her mother. "Why didn't you ever ask him?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because there are things you do not put into words. Things that are safer as silence. I knew what the room was in the way you know things you have not been told. and I knew that speaking it aloud, turning it into a conversation, would put us all in danger. She folded her hands on the table. The writer had taken what they could carry and left the room as it was, hoping that whoever came after would understand its purpose and choose accordingly. One instruction remained. There was a second room. The writer would not describe where it was. If the reader had need of it, they would find it. If they did not have need of it, it was better they did not know. The letter ended with a prayer for mercy on everyone who had ever sheltered in that darkness, and on everyone who had made the choice to keep the light on for them. George folded it and held it for a long moment without speaking. "A second room," Nora said. George nodded. They looked at each other in the lantern light in the low stone chamber beneath the dining room floor, and neither of them said what both of them were thinking. The discovery was reported to the Harlan County Sheriff 3 days after George found the panel in the floor. The delay was deliberate. Eleanor had asked for time, and George and Nora had granted it without fully articulating why. There was an instinct at work that none of them could easily explain. A sense that the room and its contents existed in a category of history not entirely theirs to expose, that whatever decision they made about the staircase and what lay at its bottom carried a weight deserving of consideration. By 1887, slavery had been abolished for 22 years. The Civil War had been over for the same length of time. The Underground Railroad, to the extent it had ever been publicly acknowledged, was by that point becoming the subject of memoir and tribute rather than criminal investigation. The legal danger of having housed runaways had not existed for a generation, but the personal histories involved were another matter entirely. The previous owner of the house, the man who had sold it to Cord Harwick in 1856, was named Rufus Slagle. Rufus was dead. His son Clarence was not. He was 61 years old and lived 4 miles from Loyal. By all observable measures, he was a man of standing, a lawyer who had served 2 terms on the county court, whose family was known and respected, whose name appeared wherever leading men of the county were mentioned. The letter in the box had said the room was built in 1847 by a man whose name would not be written. It had said the house above had been sold to someone whose sympathies were unknown. It had not named Rufus Slagle, but the timeline was precise. The room had been built in 1847 when the Slagles owned the property. The letter had been written in 1857 when the Slagles had just sold it to Cord Harwick. The letter writer had been intimately familiar with the room and its history, and had been associated with the property at or just before the time of the sale. George had no desire to start a county-wide controversy about a history that could not be undone. Neither did Eleonora, who had lived alongside whatever that history was for 31 years and had made her own decisions about silence. Neither, in truth, did Nora, who understood instinctively that what was in that room was not a crime but an act of conscience, and that whatever came next needed to be handled with care. What forced the matter was not moral obligation or legal compulsion. It was the second room. Because in the 3 days between George's first descent and the formal report to the sheriff, George had gone back down. He had spent an afternoon with the lantern, working his hands along every inch of the timbered shoring of the chamber walls, and he had found it. It was not obvious. That needs to be stated plainly. Whoever had built it had not wanted it to be obvious, and they had done their work extremely well. The joint in the east wall was invisible to the eye. The timber shoring appeared, to any ordinary inspection, solid and continuous. What gave it away, what George found after 2 hours of careful examination, was something thermal. Working along the east wall with his palm flat against the timber, he found a section roughly 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, where the temperature of the wood was perceptibly different from the sections on either side of it. Cooler. Not dramatically cold, but enough, when attention was specifically directed toward temperature rather than visual cues, to register as wrong. Cold enters a structure from outside. The east wall of the lower chamber was built against solid stone ridge with no exterior exposure, no window, no obvious source of outside air. And yet the center of that wall was cooler than the sections beside it. George took out his blade and worked it along the bottom edge of the section. He found the same manufactured joint, fitted so tightly it was barely visible. He worked up the sides and across the top. The panel was approximately 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, hinged at the top in a way that caused it to swing inward rather than outward when released. He found the release mechanism on the left side, a recess pin, and pressed it. The panel swung inward silently on well-maintained hinges. Behind it was a passage, not a room, a tunnel. Low and narrow, roughly 4.5 feet high and just over 2 feet wide, shored with smaller timbers and fitted stones running east and then curving slightly north, disappearing beyond the lantern's range after perhaps 15 feet. George stood at the entrance for a long time. The faint draft he had detected on his first descent was stronger here. It came from the tunnel. The tunnel connected to outside air somewhere, and the cold coming through it had been conducting through the timber shoring of the east wall. He went in. The tunnel ran approximately 40 feet before opening into a third space smaller than the first chamber, roughly 6 feet by 6 feet, with a timber ceiling just high enough to stand in. It was bare of furniture, bare of almost everything, almost. On the floor in the center of the earth was a collection of objects that George could not initially process as a coherent scene. It was only after crouching over them with the lantern and spending several minutes looking that he understood what he was seeing. There were shoes. A pair of small leather shoes, child's shoes, the soles worn thin and the uppers cracked and stiff with age. Beside them, a small piece of cloth. George opened it. It was a child's nightcap, the kind a toddler might wear to sleep, its fabric the color of old ivory. And beneath the cloth, on the bare earth floor, was a small wooden cross no more than 8 inches long, fashioned from 2 sticks bound together with twine. The twine had been tied with a particular kind of care, not functional tying. The cross would have held without it. It had been tied the way a person ties something when they are taking their time, when the act of tying is itself a form of meaning. George sat in the second room, 40 feet from the main chamber, 100 feet from the house above, in the core of a Kentucky ridge, and held the lantern over those objects for a long time. Then he put them back exactly as he had found them. He marked the position of each with small stones before moving them so he could replace them precisely. He did not know why this seemed important. It simply did. Then he went back through the tunnel, back into the main chamber, back up the stone stairs, and told his wife and her mother what he had found. Sheriff Aldous Crane of Harlan County was 54 years old, a native of the county, a man who had served as sheriff for 11 years and had in that time developed a philosophy about complexity that he expressed, when pressed, in the following terms. Some things are over, and the best thing you can do with them is understand them properly before you put them down. He came to the Harwick house on a Thursday morning in late March, accompanied by his deputy, a 23-year-old man named Frederick Patton, who had been deputized 6 months earlier. Crane came, saw the panel, descended the stairs, walked the tunnel to the second room, and spent perhaps 40 minutes in the 2 underground spaces before he came back up. He sat in Eleanor Harwick's kitchen and drank the coffee she put in front of him, and did not speak for several minutes. Then he asked her 3 questions. The first, did your husband tell you anything about this room before he died? Eleanor said no, not directly. The second, did you have any indication while living in this house that the room was in use? Eleanor said once, in the autumn of 1860, she had heard something she believed was coming from below the dining room floor at night. She had thought it was an animal. She had not investigated. The third, was there anyone still living in the county who she believed had knowledge of how the room had been used? Eleanor looked at him steadily. I have my suspicions, she said, but I would not say without being certain. Crane nodded. He looked at George. The documents in the box. You have read them all? Yes, George said, and I would like to give them to you intact. Good. Crane wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. I am going to need to look more carefully into the history of this property and the previous owners. The Slaggles. I know the family. He paused. I know Clarence. Oddsat. The name sat in the room for a moment without anyone commenting on it. Crane instructed his deputy to go through the county deed records that week, everything related to the property from the time it was built. He told George to leave the room exactly as it was, not to take or move anything. Whatever is down there, he said, is part of a history I intend to record properly. Then he finished his coffee, put on his hat, walked to the door, and paused. Mrs. Harwick, he said, You lived in this house for 31 years. I have, Eleonora said, and you never knew. I suspected, she said, but I never knew. Crane was quiet for a moment. There is a difference, he said. Sometimes a significant one. And then he left. Clarence Slagle was by all observable measures a success. His father Rufus had been a farmer of middling means, comfortable but not wealthy, respected in the way that men who attend church and pay their debts tend to be respected, without any particular distinction. Clarence had considerably exceeded his father's station. He had studied law, returned to Harlan County in his 20s, built a practice, married well. Over the following decades, he had become a figure of genuine local significance. He had served on the county court, helped organize the Methodist congregation's new building fund, and contributed to the local subscription school. When strangers passed through and asked who the leading men of the county were, his name was mentioned. Sheriff Crane called on him on the last Tuesday of March, 9 days after the initial report. He went alone without his deputy, which was not standard procedure for a formal interview, but which Crane had decided was appropriate given the nature of what was being discussed. He drove his buggy to the Slagle property, a handsome place on the south side of Harlan Town with a well-kept yard and a painted fence. Clarence was in the parlor reading. The two men had known each other for more than a decade. They were not close friends, but they were acquainted in the way that public men in small counties inevitably become acquainted, with a mutual familiarity founded on professional respect and careful distance. Crane sat in the offered chair and made no preliminary small talk. He told Clarence about the discovery at the Harwick house. He described the chamber, the tunnel, the second room. He mentioned the documents in the box. He watched Clarence's face throughout. Clarence's face was exceptional in its control. It produced in sequence the expressions that a guilty man with years of practice would produce when hearing news he had perhaps half expected but hoped never to face. First, a look of careful surprise, precisely modulated, not so theatrical as to seem performed, not so minimal as to seem withheld. Then a look of appropriate gravity. Then a slight forward lean, the posture of a man following a story with interest rather than fear. It was a very good performance. Crane, who had observed many performances in his professional capacity, thought it was among the better ones he had encountered. He let Clarence finish it. Then he said, "The letter in the box states that the room was built in 1847 by a man whose name is not given. Your family owned this property from 1841 to 1856. Your father was Rufus Slagle. Did your father ever speak to you about this room?" Clarence's expression settled into one of sincere regret. He said he had never known about any room. His father had died when he was 22. Whatever the man may have done on that property, he had never discussed it with his son. "Is that so?" Crane said. It was not a question. Clarence said he could not speak to what his father had done before he was old enough to understand such things. If the sheriff was asking whether he had any personal knowledge of the room or its construction, the honest answer was no. Crane looked at him for a moment. "What about after?" "After you came of age? After your father's death?" A very brief, very controlled pause. "What do you mean?" Clarence said. Crane explained. Rufus Slagle had died in 1867. There had been an 11-year gap between his death and the present day. 11 years during which Clarence had been a grown man in the county, familiar with the property's history. And based on what Mrs. Harwick had told him, the room may have been in use at least once during that period. A man who knew such a room existed might have reason to want to know whether it was still available even after the property changed hands. Another pause, this one slightly longer. "I have nothing to add to what I have already told you," Clarence said. His voice was level, his eyes steady. He had made a decision about exactly how far this conversation would go. Crane recognized the decision. He nodded, stood, thanked Clarence for his time, and drove back to his office. That evening in his official log, he wrote that he had called on Clarence Slagle regarding the discovery at the Harwick house. Slagle denied knowledge of the room or its construction and denied any involvement following his father's death. Credibility of denial uncertain. No documentary evidence to the contrary at present. Matter requires further inquiry. He underlined the last sentence. The further inquiry came from an unexpected direction. Walter Harwick, Eleonora's oldest son, arrived in Harlan County 10 days after the initial discovery. He had received a letter from Nora describing what had been found and had come in the way that the eldest child of an aging parent comes when something significant happens, dutiful and slightly delayed, full of practical concern, vaguely guilty about the distance he had let grow between himself and home. He was 43 years old, heavier than he had been, with the careful manner of a man who had spent 20 years running a mill and had learned that imprecision costs fingers. He was not an imaginative person. He preferred documentation he had brought from his home in Bell County, something he had not mentioned in any correspondence. It was his father's journal, not the aid memoir from the box beneath the floor, which had been a record kept by whoever had been using the room before the Harwicks arrived. This was a different document, a personal journal that Cord Harwick had kept for much of his life, which Walter had found among his father's effects after Cord's death in 1881 and had kept without reading, on the instinct, or perhaps the fear that it contained things he was not prepared to know. He had read it finally on the 2-day journey from Bell County to Harlan County in the back of a hired wagon over rough mountain roads. He gave it to Sheriff Crane on the morning of his arrival. Crane read it over the course of the following day and a half. The journal covered roughly 25 years from the mid-1850s through the late 1870s. Cord Harwick had not been a literary man. His entries were terse and factual, more account book than confession, recording weather and transactions and farm yields and occasional observations on local events. But running through the practical record, surfacing at intervals like a current beneath still water, was something else. Cord Harwick had known about the room from the day he bought the house, not because Rufus Slagle had told him during the sale. The journal made clear no such conversation had taken place, that the discovery had been Cord's own, made within the first week of occupancy during a repair to the dining room. But he had understood immediately what the room was. He had gone down, seen the sleeping platform, the stove, the tunnel, and he had made a decision. He had left everything exactly as it was. The journal recorded 4 additional uses of the room after the Harwicks took occupancy. 4 times between 1857 and 1863, Cord Harwick had opened the panel in his dining room floor and allowed people to descend into the chamber beneath it. He had brought food down in the evenings. He had kept the stove going in winter. He had stayed awake nights listening, aware that what he was doing, if discovered, could cost him everything. He had not recorded names. Not once in 4 entries did he write the name of anyone who had sheltered in his house. The entries were brief to the point of fragmentation. The room occupied 3 days, departed north, cold weather, roof repaired Friday. The deliberateness of those omissions was itself a form of documentation, the record of a man who understood precisely what risk he was managing. The final entry related to the room was dated November 1863. It was the longest of the 4, and unlike the others, it contained something that came close to an emotional record. Cord wrote that he believed the road had changed and that he no longer knew the new contacts. He wrote that Rufus's boy had come to see him the previous autumn about a matter he would not state plainly, and that he had told him plainly he did not know what the man was speaking of and had sent him away. He believed the visit had been a fishing expedition, and he would not be fished. Then he wrote this: "What is in this house is in this house, and it is mine to decide what becomes of it." He had thought sometimes about writing down everything he knew, every name he could remember, every direction he had given, every night he had spent listening. But he had thought better of it every time. Those people did not need their history written in a document that could be found. They had carried their own histories. They had taken them north where they belonged. He would say, only this: the room had served. It had served 11 people over 6 years. Of 2 he knew for certain they had arrived safely. The rest he could only pray for. 11 people. That was a number he would carry to his death. The room was still there. Some things were meant to remain. Crane set the journal on his desk and sat with it for a long time. Then he went to find Walter Harwick. "Rufus's boy came to see me last autumn about a matter he would not state plainly." That line from Cord Harwick's journal became the axis around which the investigation turned. Crane had already noted in his visit to Clarence Slagle what he described as credibility of denial uncertain. He now had a man who had come to the Harwick property sometime around 1862 or 1863 based on Cord's timeline, asking about something he would not name directly. Oh. A man who had grown up on that same property, whose father had owned it during the period when the room was first built. A man who, when asked directly, claimed no knowledge of the room's existence. If Clarence had visited Cord Harwick in 1862 or 1863, which would have made him approximately 37 or 38 years old at the time, and if his purpose had been what Cord's terse dismissal suggested, then the question was why. By 1862, the Civil War was in its second year. The question of slavery, which had been a matter of political and moral argument for decades, had become a matter of artillery fire and military mobilization. Harlan County, like much of the Mountain South, was deeply divided, not along the neat geographic lines that later memory would assign to the conflict, but within communities and sometimes within families. Some men had gone south to join Confederate forces. Others had joined the Union. Many had done neither, attempting a neutrality that the war made increasingly impossible. The room beneath the Harwick dining room had been built to serve people moving north. Whether it had continued to serve that purpose after 1861, and under what circumstances, was both morally and legally complex in ways the pre-war situation had not been. What had Clarence Slagle wanted from Cord Harwick in the autumn of that wartime year? Crane thought about this for a long time before deciding on an approach. He went back to Clarence. This time he brought Frederick Patton. He brought a precise transcription he had made by hand of the relevant passage from Cord's journal, not the original which he had secured as evidence, but an exact copy. He sat in Clarence's parlor in the same chair as before and read the passage aloud. Clarence listened without expression. The journal identifies you as the person who visited Cord Harwick in the autumn of 1862 or 1863, Crane said, and inquired about a matter you would not state plainly. Cord Harwick believed you were asking about the room. He told you he did not know what you were speaking of. Clarence said he had no recollection of any such visit. Do you have no recollection? Crane said carefully. Or are you telling me it did not happen? A silence. Those are different things, Crane said. Clarence Slagle looked at the sheriff of Harlan County for a long moment. He was 61 years old. A man of substance and standing who had spent his entire adult life building a reputation he had reason to value. He had a wife, grown children, a practice, a name that meant something in the county. He also, Crane suspected, had a personal history, not a criminal one in any prosecutable sense, but a history of choices made and silences kept that was considerably more complicated than the public man in the parlor would have wished it to be. "What is it you want from me?" Clarence said. His voice was still level, the performance gone. He was simply asking a direct question. "The truth," Crane said, "as much of it as you know. Not for the purpose of prosecution. There is nothing to prosecute. The war has been over for 20 years, and the law has changed in every direction that matters. I want the truth because there is a history in those two rooms that deserves to be understood completely, and you are one of the few people still living who might be able to provide the pieces I do not have." Clarence looked out the window. His hands folded on his knee did not move. A long silence. "My father built that room," he said. "I was 14 years old. I helped carry the timber down. I thought we were building a second cellar for dry storage." He paused. "He told me the truth 3 years later. I was 17. He took me down and explained what the room was and what it had been used for and why. My father was a complicated man. In many ways a man of his time, which is to say there were things he accepted without question that I now know were wrong. But the room was something he had done with his full conscience, and he was not ashamed of it. Did he tell you how many people had used it? He said 17 over 7 years, but he said the number carefully. He was uncertain about several of them. 17, the same number in the letter in the box. And when you went to see Cord Harwick, Clarence was quiet for a moment. My father had died the year before, 1861. I had known since the house was sold to Harwick in 1856 that the room was still there. I did not know Harwick's sympathies In 1862, when the war had been running for a year and the situation in the mountains was complicated, I wanted to know if the room was still being used. Not to stop it, I wanted to know because I had information about routes, about contacts that might have been useful to anyone still using it. He stopped. Harwick did not trust me. I cannot say I blame him. I was Slagle's son, and I was a lawyer, and there was no reason on earth for him to take my word for anything. He told me he did not know what I was talking about and showed me the door. And after that, nothing. The war ended. Everything changed. He looked back at Crane. There was a child, he said. Crane was still. In the second room, Clarence said, in 1849, when I was 23. A woman and a child, the child perhaps 2 years old. The woman had carried the child the entire way from Carter County, Virginia, almost 90 miles. She arrived at the property in the middle of a cold October night. He stopped. The child died 3 days into the stay from the cold and the exhaustion of the journey. The woman, I do not know her name. My father never told me. She stayed for another 2 days and then she went north. My father buried the child in the second room. He could not mark it above ground because he could not risk anyone finding it and asking questions. He placed a cross and the child's belongings in the earth and pressed the soil over them, and that was the burial. George Prout, in his second descent to the small room at the end of the tunnel, had found shoes, a nightcap, a cross bound with twine. He had put them back exactly as he found them. Do you know if the woman survived? No, Clarence said. My father looked for years. He never found out. The letter in the box addressed to whoever uses this place after me had been dated April 14th, 1857. The Slagles had sold the property to Cord Harwick in the spring of 1856. The letter had been written a full year after the sale. Rufus Slagle, who had already left the property, would not have had access to the room after that point. Crane had noted this discrepancy from the beginning, but had held it in reserve, waiting for the investigation to produce a candidate. When he read the letter again after his second conversation with Clarence, he noticed something he had registered but not yet acted on. The handwriting. He had in his possession 3 documents written by the same hand. The journal from the box, the fragment of a letter beginning mid-sentence, and the complete letter to whoever uses this place after me. The same person had written all 3, and that person had not been Rufus Slagle. Crane had found a deed signed by Rufus in the county records, and the handwriting did not match. The handwriting was that of an educated person. The language was that of an educated person. That closing prayer, that hope for mercy on everyone who had sheltered in that darkness and on everyone who had kept the light on for them, was not the language of a farmer. It was the language of a farmer. It was the language of someone trained in careful expression. Crane asked Clarence whether his father had ever had an associate, a confidant, anyone with knowledge of the room who had been closely connected to the property. Clarence thought for a long time. There was a minister, he said. He served the area around Loyal from roughly 1845 to perhaps 1858. His name was Alden Price, a Welsh family originally from somewhere in western Virginia. He was educated, had studied theology somewhere, though he was never formally ordained. He called himself simply a minister. He was a friend of my father's. He visited the property many times. He knew about the room. Crane found the handwriting of Alden Price in the archives of the Methodist congregation at Loyal, in the minutes of several meetings written during Price's tenure. The handwriting matched the documents from the box precisely. Alden Price had kept the record of the room's uses. Alden Price had written the letter. Alden Price had known the routes, managed the practical realities, maintained the connections. And Alden Price had left the county in 1857 and, according to every record Crane could find, had never returned. The aid memoir from the box, the small leather-bound journal of routes and initials, turned out to be more legible than it had initially appeared. Oh, it required a key, which Crane eventually worked out with Walter Harwick's assistance over several evenings, and once deciphered it produced a meticulous record. 17 people over 7 years, from 1847 to 1854. The entries were brief: a date, a set of initials, a direction of travel, and occasionally a notation. Arrived well, continued 2 days. And in 3 cases, a small mark that Crane and Walter agreed, after long consideration, almost certainly indicated uncertainty about the outcome. 17 people, men and women, and in at least 2 cases, children. From Virginia, most of them based on the directional notations, moving north toward the river crossings in central and northern Kentucky, and from there toward Ohio, toward Indiana, toward whatever continued life they could build beyond the reach of the laws that had claimed ownership of them. Crane could not identify any of the 17 from the initials alone. He wrote to contacts in several Ohio and Indiana counties describing what he had found and asking whether any local records showed persons of this approximate timing and origin who had settled there. He received over the following months 2 responses of cautious interest, one from a clerk in Athens County, Ohio, one from a minister in Shelby County, Indiana, but neither could be definitively connected to the Harlan County room. The 9 confirmed safe arrivals mentioned in the letter remained unconfirmable. What could be confirmed, and what Crane documented with considerable care, was the physical record, the room, the tunnel, the second room, the sleeping platform, the stove and its concealed ventilation, the wooden box and its contents, the cross in the earth. He wrote it all down in the official log of Harlan County in the clear and methodical prose of a man who understood that the record itself was a form of obligation. The deposition he took from Eleanora Harwick, her formal statement regarding what she had suspected, and when, and the distinction she made between suspecting and knowing was written into the same record. The deposition from Clarence Slagle, who came to the office voluntarily and dictated a full account of what his father had told him and what he himself had known. The transcriptions from Cord Harwick's journal. The authenticated handwriting comparison establishing Alden Price as the author of the documents in the box. It was the most complete account anyone could produce 30 years after the fact of a small informal station in the mountain roots of the pre-war South. It could not name the 17. It could not confirm the 9. It could not find Alden Price or determine where he had gone in 1857 or what had become of him afterward. But it established what had happened in that house. And it established, and this was the detail Crane returned to more than any other in the years after he closed the formal investigation, that it had been done in silence. Not in organization, not with official sanction, not with recognition. In silence, in the cold, in the dark, by ordinary people who had decided to open a door. The investigation concluded formally in August of 1887, 5 months after George Prout lifted the floor panel in the dining room. Crane's official record ran to 37 handwritten pages. He filed it with the county court, made a copy for his own archive, and provided Eleanora Harwick with a summary. Eleanora read the summary at the kitchen table with Nora beside her on a warm afternoon in late August, with the windows open and the sound of the creek audible from below the ridge. She read it without commenting, turning the pages carefully, her face controlled in the way it always was. When she finished, she folded it neatly and set it on the table. 31 years, she said, and I ate my meals above that room for 31 years. Nora looked at her. Does that disturb you? Does that disturb you? Eleanora thought about it genuinely, not as a deflection. No, she said finally, it does not disturb me. What disturbs me is that I did not know. What disturbs me is that Cord could not tell me. Either he did not trust that I would understand, or he thought the knowing would be a burden for me. Either way, he carried it alone for 30 years, and now he is dead. And the people in those rooms are gone, and the only one left to account for any of it is an old woman who did not know. You suspected, Nora said. Suspecting is not knowing, Eleanora said. She was quiet for a long moment. The child in the second room, she said. The child buried in the earth at the end of that tunnel. That child has been under my house for 40 years. Neither of them spoke. I want a proper burial, Eleanora said. Whatever can be done. Will George arrange it? Yes, Nora said, he will. George Prout, in consultation with the Methodist minister in Loyal and with the agreement of Sheriff Crane, arranged a small private ceremony in the family burial plot at the edge of the Harwick property. The remains, fragmentary after 40 years in the earth, were moved with care and reinterred with a marker. The marker bore no name because no name was known. It bore only a date, approximately 1849, and a small cross echoing the one that had been found in the second room. Eleonora attended. Nora and George attended. Sheriff Crane attended. Clarence Slagle, who had learned of the arrangement through Crane, attended as well, standing apart at a slight distance, his hat in his hands, saying nothing. It was a quiet ceremony, as it had to be. The congregation was small, and the grave was small, and the day was overcast, the kind of Kentucky late summer day that carries in it the first cold breath of the coming autumn. The minister said what ministers say when they bury the unknown. A prayer for the soul, a prayer for peace, a hope that the journey home had been short. Eleonora stood at the grave for a long time after the others had moved back. Then she went inside and made supper, and the ridge above Martin's Fork Creek was quiet as the evening came on. Eleonora Harwick continued to live in the house on the ridge for 4 more years, until her death in the spring of 1891 at the age of 76. She died in her own bed with Nora beside her. The panel in the dining room floor had been left intact. George had resealed it after the investigation, precisely as it had been. The pin latch, the hinges, the invisible join, it could still be opened. But Eleonora had made clear she did not want it altered or covered or removed. It was built for a purpose, she told Nora in one of the conversations they had in the months after the investigation ended. It served that purpose. It should stay as it is. She ate her meals above it for 4 more years, now knowing what it was, now knowing some of the names. Not the names of the 17 who had sheltered there, but the names of the men who had built and maintained it, the minister who had kept its record, the woman who had walked 90 miles through October mountains with a child too small to survive the journey. She ate her meals above all of it, and the knowing, she said, changed things. Not in the dramatic way that secrets revealed in stories tend to change things, not as revelation or rupture, but in the quiet way that truth changes the texture of ordinary life. The same table, the same chairs, the same creak sound from below the ridge, but underneath a room, a record, a small grave at the edge of the property. I think about them, she told Nora once. Not at particular times, just I think about them. The way you think about people you never met but whose existence has touched yours. I think about the woman who left her child in that earth and went north. I wonder if she made it. I wonder if she thought about that room for the rest of her life. She was quiet for a moment. I think she did, she said. I think some rooms stay with you forever. When Nora Pruitt inherited the property after Eleonora's death in 1891, she and George debated what to do with it. The house was old and would require significant maintenance. The farm had not been actively worked for years. They had their own property 6 miles away, but neither of them could bring themselves to sell. They rented it instead to a family named Hensley, who lived in it for 12 years without ever learning about the panel in the dining room floor. George had sealed it thoroughly before the Hensleys moved in and placed a heavy sideboard over the section, not to conceal it exactly, but to protect it. When the Hensley family left in 1903, Nora had the panel opened and inspected. Everything below was as it had been. The sleeping platform, the iron stove, the box now emptied of its documents which were in Crane's archive, the wool blanket still folded on their hook, 20 years older and more fragile, the tunnel to the second room with the small cross still in the earth where George had replaced it. She sealed it again. Sheriff Aldous Crane died in 1899 after serving as Harlan County Sheriff for 23 years. The 37-page record he had compiled passed into the county court archive, where it remained. His deputy, Frederick Patton, who by 1899 had become the county clerk, ensured it was preserved and properly filed. Walter Harwick, who had brought his father's journal from Bell County and participated throughout the investigation, wrote his own account of the discovery in 1895, a decade after the fact. He wrote it for himself and for his grown children who had asked about the room their grandmother had told them about in her final years. His account ran to 40 pages in the careful, precise hand of a mill operator who understood the value of accurate records. Walter's account included a detail none of the official documents had captured. His own recollection of a conversation with his father, Cord Harwick, in the late summer of 1878, 3 years before Cord's death. Walter had been 34 and had come for a visit. One evening, sitting on the porch after supper while Eleanor was inside, Cord had said something Walter had not understood at the time. "I built a good house," Cord had said. "It was good before I got here. I kept it good. That is all any man can do." Walter had thought his father was talking about carpentry or farming or the ordinary pride a man takes in a well-maintained property. He knew what it meant now. "It was good before I got here. I kept it good." 11 people had descended those stairs under Cord Harwick's care and gone north. Of the two whose safe arrivals Cord had confirmed, one, Walter had learned after years of quiet searching through a contact in central Ohio, had been a man named Charles, surname unknown, who had worked as a blacksmith in a small town in Greene County, Ohio, for the remainder of his life. He had died in 1879, 8 years before the floor panel was discovered, married with 4 children. His death notice described him as a man of great dignity and good humor, much beloved by those who knew him. That was all Walter had found. One name, partial, one life partial, out of 11. "I do not know what happened to the other 10, he wrote. "I believe my father did not know either. The uncertainty seemed to be something he accepted, not peacefully exactly, but with the recognition that some things cannot be resolved. He helped. He kept the secret." He did not know for most of his life whether the helping had mattered. He kept it good anyway. I think that is the only kind of courage that actually exists, not the kind where you know the outcome. The kind where you do not. The Harwick property passed out of the family's possession in 1911 when George Prout, in his early 60s and in declining health, made the decision to sell. By that time, the railroad had arrived in Harlan County and the coal companies with it, and the county had changed in ways that none of the people who had lived through the discovery of 1887 could entirely have anticipated. The mountains were being opened, the valleys filled. A world defined by isolation and self-sufficiency was giving way to something noisier and more connected and more brutal. The buyer was a mining company's representative who purchased the Ridge property along with several adjacent parcels as part of a larger land acquisition. The house was eventually demolished to make way for a service road. The outbuildings went with it. The root cellar in the hillside was collapsed and filled. The family burial plot was not disturbed. The graves of Cord Harwick and Eleanor Harwick and the small unmarked grave with its replacement stone were situated at the edge of the original property boundary and were not included in the mining company's operational area. A fence was put around them. The fence stood for many years and then did not. The panel in the dining room floor went with the house when the house came down. The chamber below, dug into the stone of the ridge, may still be there under whatever surface now covers that ground under the weight of more than a century of accumulated time. The tunnel running 40 feet east through the mountain. The small room at the end of it, where a child was buried in the autumn of 1849. These things do not disappear simply because the structures above them are removed. The record in the Harlan County Court Archives survived. Frederick Patton had ensured it was properly preserved, and when the county reorganized its records in the early 1900s, the file was retained. Aldis Crane's 37 handwritten pages, the transcriptions from Cord Harwick's journal, the depositions from Eleanor Harwick and Clarence Slagle, the handwriting comparison for Alden Price, and in the county archive of Bell County among the personal papers donated by the Harwick family in 1924. The year after Walter Harwick's death, the 40-page account Walter had written in 1895 in the careful hand of a man who knew the value of accurate records. Alden Price was never found. Whatever had taken him away from Harlan County in 1857, and wherever he had gone, he had not left a trail that anyone before or after the investigation could follow. The routes he had mapped in his small leather journal ran through mountains now changed almost beyond recognition. The creeks were still there, but the paths had been altered, the farms replaced by mining operations and logging roads, and eventually by the slow encroachment of vegetation over abandoned ground. The woman who had carried her child 90 miles through those mountains in October 1849 remained unnamed. She had passed through the room and gone north and vanished into whatever life she had made or failed to make beyond the reach of documentation. Her child was buried in Kentucky. She was somewhere else. 17 people, 9 confirmed safe arrivals, one partial name recovered decades later in an Ohio death notice. A man of great dignity and good humor, much beloved by those who knew him. And beneath a dining room floor, hidden for 31 years from the woman who ate her meals above it, a staircase of cut stone descending into the dark. Built not for secrecy's own sake, but for the oldest reason that human beings build hidden things. Because there were people who needed to be hidden, and someone chose to build. The floor panel was lifted in the spring of 1887. The stone stairs went down 11 steps to a low-ceilinged room of timber and earth. The room was clean. The stove was cold. The blankets were still folded on their hook. The tunnel ran 40 feet east through the mountain. At the end of the tunnel, in the earth of a small room that no one had entered in 30 years, a cross was bound with twine. Someone had tied it carefully. The way a person ties something when the act of tying is itself a form of meaning.